Good evening, everybody. Let me just adjust my window briefly so I can actually see what I'm saying. Welcome, everyone. It's office hours time again. Missed it last month due to K-scope commitments and almost missed this month, traveling overseas tomorrow, but did want to cancel 2 months in a row. So thank you very much for joining me on this Wednesday evening, my time. Always appreciate you giving up your time. I get paid to do this, so and I enjoy doing it. So anyone that gives up their time, I'm thrilled for you to do it. Someone's just pointed out to me that the chat appears to be disabled. So I've sent out a chat saying hi all to everyone. Hopefully everyone can see that. If you can't work the chat, we'll have a look at that. Must be something wrong with our Zoom API or something. But if you can't use the chat, whatever you want to do, just throw everything in Q&A. Even if it's just chat, throw it as a question, so to speak, and we'll work it that way. So hopefully people can see my chat. I've just put in hi all to everyone. But yeah, if you can't see that, then we'll sort it out. But yeah, I think Q&A might be the way to go if you can't use chat. Either way, you'll see my head do this throughout the evening as I flip back to my monitor to see what's going on in the chat line. So even if chat is disabled, feel free to keep it interactive and chat on the Q&A, and we'll do our best to make amends, and we'll see what's going on there. So so someone said they can see my chat, but chat is disabled. Yeah, so I'm not sure what's going on there, but we'll do some work on this on office hours and see how we can sort things out. So we'll see how we go. Okay, so let's get started. Let's share my screen and we'll get into the hour. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Hopefully you can still see me. Hopefully you can hear me. I was about to say sing out in the chat line if you can't. Sing out with a Q&A if you can't. That's a bit of a bummer. As always, getting in touch with me is very easy. All you have to do is scan the QR code if you're a modern person. Otherwise, just note down linktree/Connor. That way you'll get Twitter, email, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, podcast, LinkedIn, any other blog, any Twitter, any other social media mechanism I can think of. I do like talking tech. If all that's a bit too much, just the Connor_MC_D is my Twitter handle. DMs are always open, so feel free to reach out that way. If you're new here to office hours, I always say this, do not adjust your set. You'll see a lot of the content either at the bottom or shifted left of the screen. That's so that when we make this into a YouTube video for your permanent record of today's or tonight's session, it won't be silly. I'll be able to put my head on the top right, and there's nothing worse, obviously, than when you have a recording of a video and someone's head is blocking the vital piece of content that you were there to see. So we do it this way such that hopefully you don't miss any of the content that appears on slides or on any of the demos. As always, a few bits and pieces before we get into the general questions and I like talking about these because it's my way of hopefully promoting your involvement in the community. So what's coming up? Well, unless you've been living under a rock for the past few months, all the social media channels from Oracle have been talking about Cloud World, the renamed Open World. It's only a month or two away now. It's in October 17th. But one thing I thought I'd bring to your attention, if you go to that fairly lengthy URL, you can now see the startings or the commencement of the session catalog. Not all the sessions that will be presented there are up there, just the ones I think so far from Oracle speakers are up there, but at least it'll already sort of whet your appetite to give you a look at what's coming up in Cloud World and hopefully give you an incentive to attend. It's in Las Vegas. I don't think there's ever been an Open World in Las Vegas, but there have been other Oracle events in Las Vegas. I've never been to Las Vegas, so hopefully I'll get a chance to go there, but hopefully you will too. So check out Cloud World. As I said, the session catalog there, 62 sessions for the Oracle database, but there are more coming. Other things coming up, the Latin America tour, normally an in-person tour, but obviously because of some of the various restrictions around the world still, this will be an online event, but please check out that. Can't stress enough what a wonderful community the Latin American community are. Last time I was fortunate enough to go to Latin America, which I think was 2018 or maybe 19. We had bus rides around. We had some fantastic tour guides. Just the nicest people you could ever hope to meet on these things. I will point out one caveat there, except for this guy, Nelson. I'm not sure if Nelson's on the call. It's probably not his time zone, but funny story about Nelson. Nelson's a lovely guy. This is purely done out of humor. I've just been to K-Scope in Texas. That's why I missed last month's office hours. And Nelson comes up to me and says, having not seen me for 2 years. And he says, geez, Connie, you looked a lot fitter last time I saw you. You had a lot more muscles. So, so thank you, Nelson, for that lovely soul-crushing experience, having not seen you for 2 years at Kscope. Just kidding. Nelson's a lovely guy. And, it'd be fantastic if you could support the Latin American community. Other things coming up, OUG Ireland in June. Sorry, I got the wrong one here. It's not that one. There's one coming up later, I think. There's one in OUG somewhere coming up. Might be Scotland somewhere. Got the wrong slide there. But coming up soon. This one definitely coming up soon, September 9th. The Polish Oracle User Group. If you're really into your deep dives in terms of tech, this is the user group event for you. Held by Kamil and Louisa. They do a fantastic event. If you're in Europe, cannot encourage you enough to get along there. It's a hybrid event as well, so there'll be some sessions done virtually. So as a result, you can attend as a virtual attendee as well if you can't make the distance to Poland. Other things coming up, the Oracle EMEA tour. So this is, you can see there, we've got Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, I'm butchering some names here, aren't I? Denmark, Luxembourg, Romania, Norway, Croatia, and Latvia, I think. Whole stack of things coming up at the end of September, start of October. Once again, if you're in any of those regions or nearby, cannot emphasize enough the importance of going along there. One particularly close to my heart, good friend of mine, Mirella, she helps set up the Romanian user group, fantastic event. Please get along there. You can still submit papers for many of those events if you're a speaker. It keeps going, doesn't it? DOAG is coming up in, where we got, September. I have a vested interest in this because I think I've got 4. I don't know. I've got a lot of talks to do in DOAG. And in particular, one of the talks I'm doing is a talk on public speaking, which is one of those great pressure moments where you have to give a public speaking talk on how to do a public speaking talk. So I figure all I can do there is fail because, any or whatever, people are going to call me out on it. But that'll be a lot of fun. Huge event, the DOAG event. So please get along to that if you're in Germany, in Dusseldorf. And finally, the recent office hours is on Wednesday tonight and not its normal usual time of Thursday, is because tomorrow I'm jumping on a flight to India and we'll be doing Chennai, Bengaluru, Delhi, Pune, Mumbai, and finishing off in Hyderabad. 6 cities in 7 days. Hopefully, if you're an Indian on the call tonight, hopefully you can get along to one of those cities. They're the 6 probably major tech cities in India. So plenty of good tech content there for everyone. A number of other Oracle speakers are going along as well. That'll be a lot of fun event. But in particular, it's just a great way of getting an immersive amount of content in 6 days. So if you ever get a chance as a speaker, I cannot recommend enough going on one of these tours, whether it's the Latin America, the European tour, or the India tour. They're a lot of fun and a great way to really bolster your speaking opportunities. That is 10 slides, really just saying, as an Oracle person who obviously came from a non-Oracle background originally, as a non-Oracle corporation, I worked with Oracle technology for about 20 years before joining Oracle. I can't stress enough, support your local user groups. They've done it very tough the last couple of years. Cannot stress enough, if they're having local meetups, go along to them. If they're not having local meetups, see if you can get one started, even if it's just 5 people, 10 people. I think the stronger we are as an Oracle community just by having face-to-face, and it blew me away, the euphoria that came at Kscope. The amount of people that just wanted to come up and talk and hug and chat and say hello, simply because we've missed that face-to-face content for so long. So support your local user groups, get along to any events they're hosting, or try help host one yourself. And I think it really helps us all prosper as both Oracle a corporation and as Oracle customers. And finally, no open questions, good. That's the definition of chat. And finally, the podcast is still there. My latest chat was I caught up in Texas with Jackie McElroy, who's both on the ODU Target Committee, so obviously a strong supporter of user groups and user group events, and a Apex expert. So if you're into your content less like this, less video and more podcasty, just jump out there and have a listen to that chatting with Jackie McElroy. Last month, I gave you a word of warning because I said my coffee machine was broken. You'll be pleased to know, I know many of you have been fretting about this. My coffee machine is now repaired. So I'm full of energy, full of vim, and feel free to throw things on the chat and questions, because last month I warned you that I'd probably be bitter and twisted and frustrated and give nasty answers. hopefully tonight we can give you much more friendly, nice, and happy answers because I've had my requisite dose of caffeine. What are we talking about tonight? We have 6 topics, but I think we'll get them through because a lot of these are actually quite short and sharp, just like little sort of tidbits of information. The 6 topics we're covering tonight are how to do reporting with SQL Developer. The with statement doesn't seem to work with DML. An interesting issue with LPAD and RPAD when it comes to PL SQL. A strange check keyword in some syntax that you wouldn't expect to see, the check keyword. Some issues with connection pool overloads. And finally, some customer issues with cursor sharing and the use of bind variables or lack of bind variables, which is one of the reasons we use cursor sharing. So a quick check of the open questions and the chat, so to speak. Without further ado, let's get into it. Quick drink. And we will try to get them all done well before the hour. Scheduling SQL Developer reports. How do we do it? Here's the question that came in. We use the reports feature in SQL Developer a lot, but we'd like to be able to schedule them in terms of being able to run them on particular intervals so that they can be distributed to end users. How do we do that? And SQL Developer natively doesn't have that facility. So if you're not familiar with SQL Developer reports, as opposed to just running your own SQLs and spooling the output in the normal sort of SQL CL, SQL Plus, SQL Developer kind of way, SQL Developer has the concept of effectively named or constructed reports that you can actually save and reuse. So if you go into the View tab in SQL Developer and scroll right down, you'll see there's an option there called Reports. And when you do that, it brings up a list of reports that either you can build or pre-canned reports, a lot of reports that are already available for you. This is, I think I'm running SQL Developer 22.1 here on this machine. So this is just a screen grab from that. And you can see we ship the product with a number of reports to help you look through your data dictionary, etc. But you can create your own in the same way. You simply give it a meaningful name, associate a piece of SQL with it, and there's a few bits and pieces as to whether you want it as HTML, etc., and you're done. And so what happens is, for example, I chose object count there, the object count report, and I simply chose to open it, and up there in the far right in my worksheet output, you can see I get the resulting SQL. If I actually go and choose to edit that SQL, etc., you can actually see what the SQL is. The option there you can see, you can also do what we call a save as. You can save a report, and that'll save it as an XML file. So if you want to schedule SQL Developer reports, so there we have what SQL Developer reports are, but if you want to schedule them, then you need to come up with some mechanism outside SQL Developer to do it. If you're going to do that, the first thing you'll need is obviously the SQL that's actually in there. If it's one of the pre-canned reports, you'll need to get it from there, or one of your own reports. Either way, it's the same thing. You want to locate the SQL. The first thing you do is you would save your report as an XML file, and it looks something like this. Now, this is some information there that SQL Developer needs. You can have these XML files and copy them from machine to machine, from environment to environment, etc., and import them in as new reports on different machines. But also inside that XML is the SQL that actually used to generate that report. So for the object count report, I've highlighted it there. You can see there's a bit of XML top and bottom, but in reality, the key crux here is the SQL statement there in orange. It's what you would expect, effectively owner, group by, etc., etc. So if you can locate the SQL, then of course you can now use that SQL in any particular tool. You could simply do it in SQL Plus, SQL CL, etc., etc. So there's my SQL. If I'm going to do it outside of SQL Developer, if I'm going to use something like SQL CL, or I'm going to use something like SQL Plus, then just having a report like that, having grabbed the SQL out of SQL Developer, isn't sufficient, because this thing, for example, takes bind variables, and obviously I need to put some metadata in there to decide how I want my reports to come out. So you might do something like this, say in SQL CL. You might say, I want the output to be HTML, not just flat text, and you might, for example, accept a from the command line, which is basically the &1 there. You might say, yep, I'll store that in a bind variable called :owner, and therefore this SQL can run unchanged. I don't need to go hacking the SQL to make sure it's going to work without bind variables. So you can do it. That's option one. Grab the SQL from a pre-canned report in SQL Developer, whether it came with a product or whether someone wrote it, save it as XML, go into the XML, find the SQL statement, and then you can simply augment it a little bit to have it run in a command line tool like SQL CL or SQL Plus. Once you've got a command line tool, obviously you can use that with cron or scheduler or any particular scheduling tool to run it and do whatever you want with it. Spool the output out and you can send it off to whoever needs it. Option 2 is SQL Developer itself actually has a command line interface that is not SQL CL. So let me do a new share and we'll show you that in action. Okay, so hopefully that font is large enough. Oh, what did I call it? 1 second. It's SQL Dev Rep. Okay, this is just a little batch file, which you'll see in a second. So to run the SQL Developer command line interface in order to access reports, first thing you need to go is go to your SQL Developer installation and go to SQL Developer /bin. That's where the executables are on Linux and Windows. And there's this thing here, which is sdcli64.exe. This is different to SQL CL. This is effectively a command line interface into the Java engine that runs SQL Developer. One of the options you can pass it is the command reports. And it comes back and says, what are the supported options for the report? Is you can use reports followed by commands like generate, name the report, give it a database connection, and et cetera, et cetera. You can even pass in bind variables. So if we were to do that, let's do it. Let's go back to press enter. So I've given this a run. I've said do run the report, generate object count by type, and it actually pops up with an error. And I was doing this today and I thought I'll keep the error in just to help you show you what to do in terms of solving it. You can see in this case, the report called object count by type actually exists in 2 places. There are 2 pre-canned reports called object count by type. The first one's under all reports, data dictionary reports, data administration uses object count by type. And the next one's in all reports times 10 reports, all objects by count. So all that's saying is there was ambiguity in the report that I requested and it spits out your normal sort of Java error. So if I actually say, yep, run the report, all reports, data dictionary, whatever. So I gave it the fully qualified name now. It's firing up a Java engine to run SQL Developer and eventually it's done. It says here that it stored the file in report.html. Let's bring that up. This will go to another window, unfortunately, I think, because it's going to be, yep. So let me now share a new window. There we go. And it brings up a HTML report, much like that. So I just brought it up so you can see what a SQL Developer report looks like. It's quite nice. It's got a nice little title. It's got some date information and it's got the stuff sort of nicely formatted. So that's perhaps one of the reasons you might choose to use the SQL Developer command line interface to get access to that sort of at least reasonably nice sort of output of HTML. Questions come in saying, do I know if the output support also, let me try that in English. Do you know if the output supports reports? God, let me try for a third time. Do you know if the output supports reports containing charts? I don't know. I actually have a chart in my SQL Developer installation. So if we get time before the end, I'll try and run that one and see if it pops up. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. We'll have to have a look. If I don't get time tonight, we'll do it and I'll do a tweet about it hopefully sometime tomorrow. But yeah, excellent question. So that was option 2. You can use sdcli64.exe, which effectively gives you a command line interface into the SQL Developer engine in order to run those canned reports. I will say though, and this is not me bagging on SQL Developer. I was talking to Jeff Smith, the product manager today, about this exact same topic. The clue with SQL Developer is in the name of the product. It's SQL Developer. Its primary focus is for you to develop applications on the Oracle database. It's not designed to be a fully fledged reporting tool. It's really cool that the reporting facilities are in there, but it's not something like BI Publisher or a dedicated reporting facility. It's great to have, but keep that in mind. If you're going to start building a massive reporting infrastructure on SQL Developer, I think you'll very quickly hit into the limitations because that's not the primary focus of that product. So option 3 is to use something which is perhaps more leaning toward the facilities that you're after in terms of reporting, being able to schedule them, etc. And one option would be Apex and subscriptions. If you're unfamiliar with Apex, and obviously this isn't an Apex office hours, one of the things you can do with pretty much most of the reporting facilities on Apex is you can see down the bottom right here on the attributes of a report, it defaults to off. You can say a report can have what we call a subscription basis. And what a subscription basis is let someone run up a region on the screen like an Apex report, but then choose to get it at regular intervals. So for example, once you've enabled that particular report, I built a very simple report here based on the employee table. Once you've done that, you can actually drop to the actions and choose subscription. And when you choose subscription, you get this facility. You said what output format will be, what's the email address, what's the subject, and how often do I get it? So just the fact of running an Apex application, finding a report, perhaps customizing that report as an end user, maybe adding some total, some grouping, shifting the columns around, changing the sorting, etc. Once you've done that, you can save that report as a named report for yourself, and then you can actually choose to subscribe to it and actually receive it as an email. And there's all these frequencies, etc. So this perhaps is a closer to the end user's requirement now because you've chosen a particular set of output, you've got some facilities to customize it as well, and you can actually get it sent to you via email on a regular basis. So Apex and subscriptions can often meet the needs without having to go a fully fledged scheduling and reporting tool. And probably the next option, if you're still considering Apex, is Apex and something like a third-party facility like Apex Office Print. I'm from Oracle. I can obviously not officially endorse the product, but I know all I can say is we do use it inside Oracle. It's a very popular product. And this is not me doing a shout out to Jackie McElroy, who works for the company. But yeah, it's a very popular product, Apex Office Print, as part of United Codes. And it's just the next level of reporting. A lot of customization. You can do word templating, etc., and obviously have schedules as well. So hopefully that gives you a lot of options as to what you could actually potentially use for doing some reporting, whether you're building those reports in SQL Developer or whether you're building them in some other facility. Be aware that you are going to hit the limitations of SQL Developer pretty soon because its primary focus is being the best development tool on the market, not the best reporting tool on the market. So hopefully that helps. Okay, good. We are going to finish early tonight. That's good. I can hopefully spend some time in Q&A or maybe get some time and go to bed early. With and DML. Here's the question that came in. I like the with clause because it lets me break down a complex SQL into smaller components. And just shout out on my YouTube channel somewhere, you'll see a video which is exactly that, why I think the with thing is perhaps the most powerful element of a SQL statement, because it's a great way of taking what I call a programmer's approach, doing things step by step in a modular fashion, and getting a relational result, a single SQL that the optimizer can rearrange however it wants to do the best set-based processing. So the with statement for me is it's like a magic box that a programmer enters and relational theory comes out the other end. So it's fantastic, but I digress. Lets me break a complex SQL into smaller components, but why does Oracle only allow it to be used for the select statement? It does not work for insert. Now, my response to that was a large question mark because I was very confident that you could definitely use a with statement in DML. So let's explore further. I got back to this person and said, what seems to be the problem? And here's an example of a very simple with statement. With some rows as select star from Scott.emp where department number equals 10, I can do select star from some rows. The with statement, as I said, very cool for providing a nice sort of encapsulation of component level SQL in order to build a larger, more complete one. Here's where our customer was going astray. So that works fine, as we can see. They said, yep, okay, let's do that. Let's turn it into an insert statement. They added insert entity, selects from star from some rows. And as they said in the initial question, there is a with statement with some DML, and it doesn't work anymore. Now, if you're familiar with statement and you're familiar with DML, you probably spotted there's a very, very simple fix to this. And all you have to do is swap things around, and that will solve the problem. As I said, I promise this will be a nice, easy, simple, quick question for this one. So yes, the with statement works fine in all DML, and the with statement works fine. It works insert there, etc. The key thing here is with is actually not a command in its own right. The with statement is a part of the select statement. In fact, if you go to the documentation, you won't ever see the with as one of the keywords in the table of contents. And that leads me to this interesting thing for you. We're going to have a little quiz for you. If you open up, and feel free to, while you're on this call, open up the Oracle documentation, any version, and open up the SQL reference manual. And you'll see all the SQL commands listed in alphabetical order. The very first one you'll see is administer, and that's a DDL command for creating things like wallets and key stores for transparent data encryption. So that's the first command, administer. If you scroll right down to the bottom, I have a question for you, and you feel free to go to the documentation. I still think you might get this wrong. What is the last command you can run in alphabetical order on, starting with a SQL Plus session or SQL CL session? Now, stress, as I said, with doesn't count, even though you can start a command with, because with is actually officially part of the select statement. So feel free to put your answers in the Q&A, or the chat as we say. What do you think the very last command is in terms of alphabetical order that you can type in an Oracle database command line? I'll give you 20 seconds. Who's going to be brave and throw in some suggestions in Q&A? Who knows their alphabet? Nobody. Oh, you're all cowards. Come on, surely someone's going to go. Okay, yep, someone's got update. Good, so we've got TU. We've gone down to update, right? Okay, that's excellent. At least someone's brave. Thank you, Flavio. I'm thrilled you actually chose to participate. Okay. Here's the answer. You would think it's update. And in fact, if you go to the documentation, update will be the last thing in there. Here's a little trick though. You can type in validate as a command. Now, if you're wondering what validate does, validate is a throwback to a very old version of Oracle before the analyze command existed. And if you've ever used the analyze command, the analyze command used to be used to calculate optimizer statistics. But the analyze command nowadays is generally used to do things like check out the structure of an index. And the full command is analyze index, index name, validate structure. Before analyze existed, you could just do validate index, index name. And because Oracle, we have had that obsession with backward compatibility, you can still to this day go into an Oracle version 19 and type in validate as a keyword. So there's some useless trivia to amuse and annoy your friends. You can ask them what's the last command alphabetically you can run in Oracle. It's validate and not update, and not with either. Anyway, there you go. Useless trivia. Who says we don't learn some interesting things here in office hours? As I said, that was nice and quick. They're all quick tonight, which is why hopefully we're going to finish early. And of course, then we can have a good old time on the chat line, except that it doesn't work. Well, that sucks. LPAD and RPAD. Some issues with LPAD and RPAD when it came to PL SQL. Here's the question that came in. We have recently upgraded, and now our PL SQL compilation times seem a lot higher. We tracked it down to routines that use LPAD or RPAD. Is there a problem with them? That seems a fairly niche kind of concept. You've upgraded to a new version, you're using PL SQL, LPAD and RPAD, and it's a compilation issue, not a runtime issue. So I fully concede I was a little bit dubious when I saw this. So I asked for some test cases, and they were happy to provide them. And so I'll happily provide them to you as well. Let's do a demo of LPAD and RPAD. So once again, this is a very easy, simple demo that you can run on your own databases as well. I'm creating a procedure here called my procedure. It's got a single variable of size varchar2 2000, and I'm going to assign it with LPAD to 2000. I don't see a problem. That's virtually instantaneous. What's the drama? Let's do one with varchar2 8000. Assign LPAD 8000, as big as the varchar can go. And same thing, a touch slower. So let's now continue on. This is as big as you can have a varchar2 in PL SQL. varchar2 32767, and I'm going to assign LPAD once again 32767. Be aware, reminder here, we're actually just creating these procedures. We're not running them, we're just creating them. And I compile that, and things start to get a bit more interesting now. That took 1.9 seconds, and we wouldn't normally expect that for a one-line or two-line PL SQL program unit. Normally they compile very, very quickly. Let's now do one with 4. Now it's the same variables, only one variable here, but we're doing 4 LPADs, and once again, just compiling. We set that going. And all of a sudden I have to have some humble pie here because I think our customer reporting this to me was actually correct. There's something going on here. We went out from 1.94 seconds, let's round that up to 2 seconds, to almost 8 seconds. So it looks like each LPAD assignment there, once again, this is just compilation, is taking about 2 seconds to actually compile. That's not so good. In fact, I wrote this little utility, which effectively is dynamically writing, it's a PL SQL program that dynamically writes PL SQL to actually measure the effect of the size of the variable. So in this case, I'm repeating those previous demos, but I'm simply doing, instead of going, I'm doing a varchar to 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, etc., to see if there's some sort of pattern, to see if it is actually linear. So this is now going to chug away. And we get some relatively good feedback that yes, if we're using a varchar to 2,000, it's 0.2 of a second. 4K, 0.3 of a second, 6K, 0.6, 12, 18. It's roughly linear up to 32K, which is back to our 1.85, almost 2 seconds. So there's definitely an issue here that we need to sort of, worry about. And some flow said, what if instead of a literal in the LPAD, you put a variable? It doesn't seem to make any difference from what we've seen. It seems to be the size of the LPAD, and I will explain why shortly. Let's now do a little bit of an alteration here. I'm going to go back in my session now and set PL SQL optimized level equals 0. And don't get me wrong, I'll explain why I did this. I didn't just pull this out of thin air and think, oh, that'll be the solution. We had to do some research internally to come up with this. I'll set optimized level to 0 and run that same thing, which is building a 2K, 4K, 6K, whatever. And you can see all of a sudden the performance is now, as you'd expect, to compile a very small PL SQL unit. It's very, very fast. So let's explain what's going on here by going back to the slides. Now, this person said, oh, we upgraded and we had this issue. It actually is not related to upgrade. It's not related to changing versions. I think this issue has been present almost back, I think, to 12.2. It's just something, it's a fairly niche scenario. The reason this person experienced it on an upgrade, they were actually going from 12, I think from 18 to 19, is it wasn't the fact that they upgraded the database, is at the same time they did a character set migration. And they did the right thing. They did what we recommend to everyone when they get the chance, and that is, modern databases require modern character sets, and modern character sets are basically UTF-8. So you need to have a multi-byte character set in order to really, support global world. The reality is, even if you only work in an English-speaking country, you're going to have people who migrate to those countries that have, special characters in their names, etc. So you want to be looking at having multi-byte character sets. It also makes things like, let's face it, the future of data seems to be JSON. JSON, XML, etc. are all generally passed around in UTF-8. Therefore, if you store them in something that's not a UTF-8 database, you might have character set conversion costs, etc., etc. So this customer did the right thing. They said, we're going to bite the bullet. We're going to migrate to a multi-byte UTF-8 character set. So we're done. And it actually only exists in multi-byte character sets. This issue exists. What happens is during compilation, when the PL SQL engine is looking at large variables and assignments such as LPAD, RPAD, etc., what it does is it's looking at options to optimize the storage of multi-byte characters. And that's why it spends a lot of time. And it just turns out that the algorithm used to actually interrogate the code is inefficient. And we're looking at fixing that. So it's actually, the PL SQL engine is looking to optimize the way it's going to store these variables. And in doing so, the effort it's going through to optimize that is actually inefficient. And that's what we're seeing there. So if you're using a multi-byte character set, that's when you're going to see this. If you're using LPAD and RPAD, and you're going to see it at compilation time, because we're doing this optimization work to actually try and improve the storage. Therefore, the workaround is simply to set optimized level to 0. and that we simply bypass that optimization, and the compile times go back to normal. Before you say, well, don't we lose out then optimization at runtime? I'd be very surprised if you see any kind of difference at all. But if you do, please shout out. We have logged a bug for this. So this will be fixed in an upcoming RU. It's just one of those things that's been around for a long, long time. We just never really seem to notice it, because one would imagine what tends to happen is people have very large PL SQL program units often when they write them. We recommend not to, but people have tens of pages of PL SQL program units. They take a little bit of time to compile anyway, so they probably never noticed the cost of these LPADs, RPADs. This particular customer, I don't know what the specifics they are, but they obviously noticed it early on, and therefore we've provided them this workaround. But yeah, just so you know, LPAD, RPAD, and multi-byte character sets and really, really large variables might have a very small impact on your PL SQL compilation time. I don't think it's a big deal, but if it is, simply set your PL SQL optimizer level to 0 and you'll be good to go. Yep, we're definitely going to get finished, I reckon, he says bravely. Strange check syntax. Who would like to throw out in the chat line? Obviously, none of you are brave tonight. Where the kind of places do you see the word check in Oracle DDL? Now, there's one obvious one that screams out of this, the check constraint. Alter table, add constraint, check. That's one place. The other place you might see it in views. I think you can define a view and say with check, which means when data comes in, effectively it must, if someone's using a view to insert, it must be valid such that it will still be visible in the view. It's a way of securing subsets of rows. But there is another place where you can see the word check, which I was unaware of until someone brought it to my attention, and I thought I'd share it tonight. I was going to run an alter table shrink command, and when I Googled for the syntax, I found an option called check, but this is not in the docs. What does it do? Now, anyone prepared to share? Has anyone ever seen the word check in conjunction with alter table shrink? I certainly hadn't until I saw this and did some reading around. Let's do a demo and see what it actually does. So I'm going to create a table as a copy of scott.m. It's hardly profound. And as you know, with any table, you can simply do alter table t shrink space. And if you run that, the first thing that's going to happen is you'll get an error. Because what does shrink space do? Shrink space is trying to look for partially free blocks and fill them with rows from other partially free blocks, and therefore to make the table a bit more dense and free up blocks at the tail of the table, for lack of a better term, in order to lower the high watermark. It's effectively taking rows from the end and trying to shunt them into free space in the start such that the table can be shrunk in size. But obviously to do that, you need to move the rows. If I'm grabbing a row from here and putting it somewhere else, I need to make sure the rows are allowed to move, which changes the row ID, and that's why we need to do alter table enable row movement. So I do that, and now I can do alter table shrink space. So far, so good. That's just stock standard use of shrink space. Let's drop that table, create table of scott.amp. This time I'll do alter table shrink space check. And you think you get an error, but because it's not in the docs, but that is actually valid syntax. And you get row movement is not enabled. You get the same error message. So it doesn't seem that we've really achieved a great deal here. We've simply got the same issue. If I then do alter table enable row movement, so I can now shrink space, let's now run that same command, alter table t shrink space check. What does it do? You will love this. It returns an error, and the error is letting you know that yes, you are allowed to do a shrink space on this because row movement is now enabled. It doesn't do it. It's simply making sure it's effectively checking to see if row movement is enabled. I find this profound, but yeah, so that command is in there and it simply says, yes, you've asked me to shrink space, but I won't. I'm just going to let you know that I could if I wanted to. Very strange, but yes, that command is in there. So that's in there. I have never seen that command in the docs. I assume it was in the docs at some stage because the error message is still there. But I've got copies of the docs from 9, 10, up to 19. It must have even been before that, but I'm not sure. I've never seen it. But there you go. Alter table t shrink space check. simply lets you know if you can actually run a shrink space command, which is effectively saying, have you got row movement enabled? And then, yes, I can go ahead and actually do it. So it seems a bit of a waste of time, but it is there. Let's go back to the slides and hopefully explain why it's probably not in the docs. So there you go. That's up there with world's most useless demos. So alter table shrink space check is a preliminary check facility to see if you are allowed to shrink the space. Interestingly enough, you would think that all this is doing is going off to the data dictionary and looking to see if row movement is enabled. However, the reason, I asked internally, the reason this is not in the docs and no longer in the docs and not supported for use is apparently running alter table T shrink space check can create deadlocks in your schema or in the data dictionary. No one internally was prepared to reveal the extent of it or why this is the case or how it happens, but one would imagine that it was obviously severe enough such that we simply took this command out of the documentation and de-supported it. So I would urge you not to run it, but yeah, it's still there. But somehow it's obviously not just doing a query to the data dictionary to see if row movement's enabled. It was probably doing some other various things in terms of locking the table, etc. And as a result, yeah, it's a no-no. So don't use alter table shrink space check. It's a command that is undocumented for very good reason and for your own safety. Not in the docs, it's not needed, and therefore do not use it. Okay, 2 to go. We're going to finish on time or even earlier. Connection pool overload. Here's the question that came in. I love that people have heard me spouting about connection pooling for so long, or very good, if you go to YouTube and search for Toon Kupelas, who's one of the real-world performance experts inside Oracle. He does a fantastic video on connection pooling, and he's also involved in ops hours. Yeah, we've been bashing people for not using connection pools so long that the first sentence here is someone defending themselves. So I promise we are not one of those sites that thinks thousands of connections to a database is a good thing. But we have hundreds of apps. So even with each having a very modest connection pool, we can't see a way of avoiding huge session counts. We're looking for ideas. So let's take a little trip down memory lane as to why connection pooling is good and how to tackle this problem for this particular customer. So the original problem was back in the day when, especially in the client server day, you had one machine, it connected to a database, and it got one foreground process or one database session assigned to it. And that session sat with that laptop or that machine for the life of the user using that application. If you had 10 people connected, you had 10 sessions logged on the database. And in the days of small user communities, generally most applications are running just inside small businesses, etc. That's not a drama. Of course, then as computers, technology, and in particular databases got more and more popular, now you had applications with many, many users trying to log into the database, and that was a drama. It generally didn't crash the database. I just did this for dramatic effect. But the reality is, it's not actually a database issue. It's more of an operating system issue. If you've got tens of thousands of database sessions, that's tens of thousands of operating system processes if everyone gets their own dedicated session. It's hard work for an operating system to manage that, not in terms of volume, but you need to think about the fact that the OS has to constantly cycle through all of those sessions, all those processes, effectively allocating, seeing, do they need a slice of the CPU? Do they need to be serviced for an IO interrupt, etc.? It's just a lot to ask of anything, in particular an OS scheduler, to manage tens of thousands of processes that all are randomly going to come up with requests for, CPU, memory, etc., etc. It's a big burden. So what did we do? We invented the concept of connection pools, and the facility is fairly simple. That is, any given user, whether they're directly connected to the database or coming in through the internet, etc., is unlikely to be asking questions of the database 100% of the time. They're doing what we do. We do a bit of work, we pause, do a bit of work, we pause. So we allocate a pool, hence the term connection pool, of sessions, and they get shared amongst the processes. So these 3 people are currently active and they're using a session each. At the moment they finish working with the database, they're now, for example, rendering a report to the screen, we free up them for other sessions to get it. And so on and so on. We have a much smaller set of sessions, and many users, whether they're internet users, PC users, etc., they all get to share that common pool of database sessions. Very intelligent way of maximizing the use of your database. You actually get far more throughput with a smaller number of sessions. It sounds counterintuitive, but what happens is, what you want to do is never have your database overloaded with sessions. You should have your application servers doing the management, because each application server might only have to manage, say, 200 or 300 programs, and it controls which ones get access to the database pie by having connection pooling at the database level. So that's what this customer's done. They've done the right thing. They've got applications using connection pools. But the new problem is this. You build an application in Java or C# or Node, etc., and you deploy that on 10 or 11 application servers, and those application servers will have a connection pool, typically connecting to some sort of schema on your database. That's application number one that's released to the outside world. In these modern times of microservices or modular components, SOA, etc., then what happens is, of course, you'll have another application, and it will have its own connection pool, and another application. It'll have its own connection pool, and another, etc., etc. So you've done the right thing on an application by application basis. You've said, I might have countless users using this application, but the application itself will have a connection pool. That's fine, but once you've got 1,000 applications or 1,000 microservices, then you've got dramas, because each one of those is now running a connection pool, and we're back in the same problem. We have oodles and oodles of database sessions, the vast majority of them idle, but effectively they're idle because we had to compartmentalize each set of sessions for each application, because each one is running its own connection pool. So how do we solve this? In fact, here is the AWR report from this particular customer. They assure me they're using connection pools, and yet look at this, 10,000 database sessions, simply because I think they got connection pool of, say, 50 or even less than that for each application, hundreds and hundreds of application, and boom, there you go. Thousands of sessions. That's going to make your database and your operating system struggle. This is one of the solutions that I would propose, and I propose it sort of with some enthusiasm now and great enthusiasm shortly. Let me explain. The Database Resident Connection Pool, or DRCP, we invented this back in, I think, Oracle 12, maybe 11.2, really designed for people using PHP on websites. Because one of the things that PHP generally does is every time it comes to the database, it does a connection request, it connects, does some work, and disconnects. And as we know, things that are very expensive in the Oracle database are starting a new connection and ending a connection. So we wanted to avoid that. So for PHP applications that didn't natively support their own connection pooling, we built one for them. It's the Database Resident Connection Pool. And what that is effectively we create a pool of sessions that is managed not by the application servers, but by the database itself. It starts up a pool of servers, and then applications connect to these pools. And in particular, as I said, it was generally about PHP. PHP says, I want to connect. We don't really do a database connection. That connection is simply ignored, and we get funneled, we get sent to one of these sessions. The database manages the sessions if they're busy or not. The PHP website does its work and it disconnects. We simply ignore that and we return the session to the pool. So in that way, for applications that didn't even support the concept of connection pooling, we could give them something that would still let them have incredibly scalable applications at the database level. So rather than the pool being managed by the application tier, it's being managed by the database itself. And it's really easy to actually set one of these things up. You can go to DBA cpool info. It shows I've got, for example, in this case, I've set one up which can be 40, minimum size 4. It's currently inactive, but literally this is all you do. You simply configure the pool for how many sessions you want to have, and you say, start the pool. Job done, right? You've now got a set of database sessions running in a connection pool sort of setup that's managed entirely by the database as opposed to the application tier. how do application tiers get access to those sessions as opposed to just normal database sessions? All they really have to do is change their connection facilities. So in your tnsnames.aura or your EasyConnect syntax, you'd simply say, I want to go to a pooled server. So for example, in JDBC, I can simply say connect localhost PDB1 and get one of the database resident connection pool facilities as opposed to my own connection pool or a dedicated connection. So it really is that easy. Now that the database is managing it, you could happily have even environments that do have support for connection pools, Java, etc., C#. Rather than each application having its own connection pool, they can now share a connection pool by talking to the database resident connection pool. How do you choose what size to make your pools then? If you're going to have one pool that manages for lots of applications, what's the good size? The way I would do it is I would say align it with AshData and VDollar_sysmetric. One of the cool things you'll find in VDollar_sysmetric and obviously your active session history reports is it'll give you the number of average active sessions in your database. And typically, if you've got, say, 10 CPUs, your average active sessions might be, say, 6. So you might choose to create a database resident connection pool of, say, 7 or 8. That way you know that you're underneath your CPU limits, but you're above what your average active sessions are. That's probably a good starting point. Obviously, if the number of active sessions goes above your CPU count, then you've got some dramas because it probably means you're underpowered on your server. But simply looking at VDollar_sysmetric for your average active sessions is a great way of starting on how big I should choose that initial database connection pool. Now, from time to time, you may exceed those limits, and therefore people have to wait. But that's a good thing. That's what you want. You want people queuing outside the database if the database is stressed. If you have people queuing inside the database when the database is stressed, you know what happens then? Your database gets more stressed and people get worse and worse service. The reason I said I'm enthusiastic about it now, but super pumped about it shortly, is I can't give you specific details, but in an upcoming release, there are a number of improvements to the database resident connection pool, which make it even better for being a one-size-fits-all connection pool strategy, even for those environments that do support connection pooling. You'll see some cool things coming up in a future release that will probably be announced at Cloud World. So keep your eyes open for that. Okay, we've got 7 minutes left and we got one more topic left. We're going to get done. Cursor sharing and binds. We have cursor sharing set to false on our environments because of some bad apps, but we are regularly seeing SQL statements with literals in our AWR reports. Has cursor sharing been desupported or modified? As you know, cursor sharing is meant to go looking for SQL that contains literals and replace them with bind variables in order to improve the parse performance. And so the question here is, if you've got it set to false, well, how come we're seeing literals in there? Has it been desupported or changed? And the answer is no. But there are some interesting idiosyncrasies with cursor sharing that you need to be aware of. Someone said, why does VDollar_sysmetric return no rows in my database? This is a question we've had before, and I'll need to look up the answer. I'll have to get back to you, Tony. I've had the same issue before, and I found out why. It might be stats level equals typical, not sure. But let me find out for you. I'll dig around. That is a common question. Let me make a note. So let me scribble that down. I should know the answer to that, but I'll find out for you and I'll tweet it. Where was I? Cursor sharing. So why are we seeing literals in our shared pool? If we have cursor sharing equals false, we're not meant to, but there are some idiosyncrasies when it comes to cursor sharing. Last demo, new share. So I'm going to set alter session cursor sharing equals false. Therefore, any literals should be replaced with binds. And let's give it a few tests. Now, I've put this comment in here, find me. There's nothing magical about that comment. It's just to make it easier to find it in the shared pool later on. So I've done select find me one, start from where employee number equals king, cursor sharing equals false. If I go look in the shared pool, it says, yep, it does exactly what it says on the box. It took that literal and replaced it with a bind variable. So yep, cursor sharing is doing exactly what we expect. What if we have a statement now that actually contains a bind variable? So now I'm doing select find me where m greater than v1. Right, so this is a good SQL now. Cursor sharing should leave it alone, and cursor sharing does. This was find me 2, and we can see that for find me 2, cursor sharing did nothing. It left it alone, which is exactly what we want because it had a bind variable in it. What if we've got a literal and a bind variable? What happens there? Well, this is find me 3, and as you can see, once again, cursor sharing has done what we're expecting it to do. It left the bind variable that was already there alone, and it replaced the literal with a bind variable. So far, cursor sharing is doing what cursor sharing does. Okay, let's try now some static SQL. So now I've got static SQL in a PL SQL block. So this is find me 4. The reason I've had to make this a hint, even though it's obviously not a valid hint, is PL SQL has a SQL optimizer inside it, and it will remove comments from the SQL before sending it to the SQL engine in order to improve the chances of shareability. So if you just put comments in there, they get stripped out by the PL SQL engine. So I've put it as a hint, so it gets left in there, even though it obviously is not a valid hint. So now I do select and I do where find me, and we get this. So this is the first thing that we need to be aware of, is cursor sharing doesn't apply to static SQL and PL SQL. Now you might be thinking, surely that's a bug, but it makes no sense for cursor sharing to touch these SQLs because this is a static piece of SQL. It is unchanging. Even though it contains a literal, the only way this gets run more than once is if multiple people run this PL SQL block. Therefore, there is no way that, like, you think about the most you think about, let me start again with a proper sentence. When you think about the problem cursor sharing is meant to solve, it's when you've got thousands of different SQLs that only differ by the value of their literals. If you've coded a static piece of SQL inside a PL SQL block, then if it's a procedure, it's going to get run many, many times. It's by definition a shareable piece of SQL because it's static. It's never changing. That literal is never changing. It's just like a hard-coded constant. So that's never going to be a problem. So cursor sharing leaves it alone. What if we have a dynamic piece of SQL inside a PL SQL block? So this is just a string now that's being sent from PL SQL over to the SQL engine. This is find me 5. And cursor sharing does what you'd expect. There we go, right? Even though it's coming from PL SQL, my dog has joined me on the call. Even though it's coming from PL SQL, because it's dynamic SQL, this is an SQL that could be built up from on the fly, therefore contain lots and lots of different literals, and so cursor sharing kicks in as you'd expect and replaces it with a bind variable. Let's now look at this one, a dynamic piece of SQL that contains a bind variable and a literal. We saw before that when we ran that in isolation, cursor sharing replaced the literal. This is dynamic SQL, and this is probably where our original question has come into being. Even if it's dynamic SQL, if there is a bind variable in there, cursor sharing will not go looking for any other literals to replace. Now, once again, this is done by design. Cursor sharing is effectively saying, if you could build an SQL that had a bind variable in it, then surely you could have dealt with this as well. Now, the reason this particular customer brought this issue up is they actually had an engine which was building SQLs which started with a template that looks something like this with some binds, and it added this dynamically. And that's why they wanted cursor sharing, because they wanted this dynamic stuff to be replaced with the bind. Unfortunately, when PL SQL builds a dynamic piece of SQL that also contains a bind, cursor sharing says, well, you built this SQL. If you can build it with a bind, you could replace that one with a bind yourself. That's the mindset of cursor sharing, and therefore it leaves it alone. Even if you break it down into its most fundamental parts and try to do it with DBMS SQL, so you're doing the parse separately, etc., you still see the same thing. Find me 7, once again, dynamic SQL that already contains a bind will not be touched by cursor sharing. So as we saw, PL SQL is special. And really this is about understanding the 8i and 9i history. We're just about done, so bear with me. When cursor sharing came along, back in 8i, it was obviously to handle the issue of replacing literals. But back in 8i, we didn't have bind variable peaking, we didn't have adaptive cursor sharing. So if you had a bind variable in a SQL statement, then that would introduce potential challenges to the optimizer. It had to optimize without knowing what the value of the bind variable was. Bind peaking didn't come along till later. So back in 8i, when cursor sharing came along, it was very, very defensive. It said, if you can see a bind variable in there and a literal, I don't want to replace that literal because you've probably coded that deliberately to give the optimizer the best information you can. Its interpretation was, you had a bind variable in there anyway, so you obviously could have replaced this literal with a bind variable. You obviously chose not to explicitly, therefore you're trying to pass this literal to the optimizer to give it the best information for the optimizer. So that's why it said, I wouldn't want to replace that literal because you've probably kept it deliberately. Version 9a came along where we did have bind peaking coming along. But once again, with bind peaking even, we had that issue of if you multiply parse the same statement, then bind peaking only looked at the first value of the bind variable once. Once again, cursor sharing saying, if I replace with the bind variable, then I'm probably robbing you of the literal that you wanted to send to the optimizer. So it's only when Oracle 11 came along with adaptive cursor sharing where we now have a far better view of being able to dig inside bind variables, pass relevant information to the optimizer, that it would make sense to actually go ahead and replace literals with bind variables and still have that confidence that it's not going to harm the execution plan. But cursor sharing has that legacy of being back from 8i days where we didn't want to replace literals unless we absolutely had to, because it was a good chance it would rob the optimizer of vital information. So hopefully that makes sense as to where cursor sharing sits. So as we said, any static SQL is by definition reusable in a Pure SQL program. Therefore, we're not going to touch it with cursor sharing. If there's an embedded bind variable in your dynamic SQL, we're assuming that you could have bound the rest of the literals anyway and deliberately chose not to. So we're not going to touch it. And I want to stress always, ideally, no one should be using cursor sharing. Always have that mindset of cursor sharing is a temporary fix to a problem of generation of literals. If you want successful applications, you really want to be taking control of those bind variables wherever possible. And we are done, almost on time. I'm surprised that we actually ran over, to be honest. Thank you very much for your time. Let me kill off the slides. As always, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining me on this rare Wednesday night. I'll be off to India in the morning once I'll go ahead and pack after this. Was it 10 p.m.? Yep, could be a brief pack. But as I said, thank you for giving up your time. Because I'm off to India tomorrow, it might be a while before this becomes a recording on the Oracle Developers channel and Ask Tom. So please be patient. But other than that, we'll look into this chat issue. That's obviously with that chat, that kills the beauty of office hours, the interactivity. And so for those that did interact tonight, thank you very much. Until next month, back on a Thursday, take care of yourselves and please support your local user groups. And we'll see you at an office hours very soon. Bye for now, everybody.